All right, y'all. So what we're going to be talking about today, and we'll try to get through it fairly quickly, is the idea of civil rights and civil liberties in the American context. And where I want to start the discussion goes way, 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 way back to the idea of the framers and the founding of the United States, and in particular the constitutional debate, the ratification debate that produced the call for, and ultimately for Madison to go about writing the Bill of Rights, which is something that Madison himself did not really necessarily see the need for. Madison rather famously called the idea of the Bill of Rights or similar sorts of lists of guarantees of the rights of people to be parchment or paper barriers, and kind of famously the idea is that parchment barriers don't stop bullets. So you can list all these protections, but they don't really mean anything unless you follow through and establish a government that in particular can't or won't be able to interfere with those things. So Madison didn't necessarily think the idea of the Bill of Rights was necessary, because he thought they had developed a government that would ensure that those rights would not be limited. So this comes from the Federalist Papers, and in particular, the portions that you care about, is that it doesn't really necessarily matter what declarations we have of particular rights. The great object in view must be to limit and qualify the powers of government so that they cannot act to violate those rights. So these exceptions sometimes against the abuse of the executive powers, sometimes against the legislative, and in some cases against the community itself, or in other words, against the majority in favor of the minority. So the idea of the protections that government needs to provide, the true source of civil rights and civil liberties has to be within the government itself. Just listing those rights for Madison wasn't going to be enough, and we'll kind of explore that a little bit as we go. So in the American context, we have this question, and this goes back to social contract theory of what makes a civil right. Well, the civil part of civil right is going to be societal, right? That's where the idea of civil comes in. It is civilization, it's the community, it's the society that provides for the civil right. If you go back before the idea of civil, this is where you're getting into the idea of nature and natural rights, and here's life, liberty, and property. And these three rights that we have according to Locke, somewhat according to Hobbes, according to the philosophy, life, liberty, property, they don't require any outside action. They don't require a government. By the nature of being human, I have life, I have freedom, I have possessions and thoughts and things that are my own. And these rights in nature are wide, they are encompassing, they mean basically everything. But if you recall, the social contract suggests that we enter society, we give up the absoluteness of these rights, we no longer have a absolute right to property. I can't just come to your house, beat you over the head, drag you out of it, and claim your home as my own. The idea of property is no longer an absolute in terms of like possession is the law. Instead, we say that because both of us or all of us want some mutual protection, I'm going to surrender my ability to steal from you. You're going to surrender your ability to steal from me. And in return, both of us will have a better claim to the protection of our property, because we are no longer absolute in our life, liberty, property. We give some of those things up. So when we enter society and allow those limitations, what we are saying is that society is going to come along and kind of parcel out different elements of, let's say, liberty. Because if you go back to the First Amendment, what we're really talking about in the First Amendment, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government, those are all different elements of liberty, right? But as we parcel them out, as we identify them, as we make particular protections and restrictions and establish a government to make those protections, we are then extending kind of that civil protection, that societal covering over those underlying three main rights, life, liberty, and property. So when we establish a right or a liberty, we kind of use those terms interchangeably. Right now, I want to use rights. We're talking about those protections that are offered by society itself. And civil rights then would be those that are granted. So if the government grants us a right, if the government grants us a protection, this is going to be, if you're going back to Berlin, this is the positive notion of freedom, the idea that government exists to bestow these things and that they will be protected and enabled by the government. So if you think of things like a right to an education, and we say that you have a right to an education or you have a right to vote. What are those truly? Are probably derived from liberty and property as kind of the natural rights. But if we take something like education, we might ask, well, is it possible for me to educate myself? Without the intervention of other human beings, without the intervention of society, without the intervention of other humans, can I provide for my own education? And you might say, well, a little bit, right? I can learn from experience, I can learn by doing, I can gather some knowledge. But if I'm really talking about education as we think of, the right to an education being like K through 12, every kid goes to school, gets taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, just the very nature of communication and speech and writing and language suggests that only exists within the context of the broader community. In order for me to be educated, I need some other people to be around. I need to have that basis to build on that society has provided in terms of language. I need to have the resources of prior scholars. We might think, well, hell, I don't need to be in school. I could just go to the library and read a book. But someone had to teach me to read, someone had to produce that book, someone had to publish it, someone had to sponsor the library. In order for me to have that right to an education, it requires some action on the part of others. It requires some protections and enabling on the part of the society as a whole, and typically we mean government. You can think of the same thing for voting. If we're going to have a right to vote, if we're going to call that a right, that has to be granted to me. I can't do that on my own. I can't create a viable ballot. I can't produce my own candidates. It requires some action and some participation by other folks. So this is that positive notion of freedom, the idea of civil rights being granted to us. So the positive notion of freedom stands in contrast a bit to the negative notion of freedom. So in this terminology, positive and negative are not value statements. Positive means with the involvement of other people. Negative means without the involvement of other people, I can do this on my own. And you can start to think of the negative notion of freedom or the negative notion of rights and liberties means that I need people to stay out of my way. Now, this can be, when I say in contrast or in opposition to the positive notion of freedom, you can take those same positive freedoms, right? The idea of education or the idea of a vote. If we're going to require everybody to have or say that we have a right to an education, we're going to need resources to provide that education. We're going to need resources to provide the mechanisms and institutions to allow for a fair vote. In order to generate those resources, government is probably going to have to impose some taxes, take some property, have a violation of your property rights. If we say that you have a right to an education and therefore from the age of 5 through the age of 18, we are going to require that you attend public school and be taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, that's a violation of your liberty, right? So at the same time that we are protecting these positive freedoms or civil granted rights on the part of the government, we're also limiting, in another sense of the term, the freedoms and rights that you have. So the negative notion of freedom is this idea that the government just needs to get out of the way and people will be able to exercise their freedoms. So this is a bit of a more of a libertarian version of the story. Now, in the American context and kind of the global democratic context, what we really have here is, a struggle on the negative freedom idea of the majority versus the minority. And this was, again, Madison's concern. If we bounce back real quick, and just come back over here, the very end of this quote, and in some cases against the community itself, or in other words, against the majority in favor of the minority. So Madison, in designing the American system and thinking of the way that you protect the parchment barriers, what Madison is concerned with isn't necessarily the majority, right? Majorities can get their way. In a democratic system, majorities have the majority vote. Majorities have strength in numbers. They have the power that goes along with that pluralist democratic majority. And minorities don't. So when we bounce back over here to the idea of positive and negative freedom, if you have a unanimous agreement over what the proper freedoms are and mutual respect amongst all people, this is again Madison's notion, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If we didn't have minority interests that are out there, then the negative notion of freedom works quite nicely. We just say government needs to stay out of our way. We can all live hunky-dory in nature, and we can all get along, sing kumbaya, and live peacefully until we, die a death of natural causes and old age. But in the real world, where we have these disagreements, where we have different minority interests, and in Madison's view, many different minority interests all competing, that's our idea of pluralism, then this negative notion of freedom, where government just stays out of the way, can become problematic. The positive version, where rights are granted and enabled and protected, allows for the structures then to protect some of those minority rights. So the positive notion of freedom gets us much closer to the idea of civil rights and civil liberties, the rights and liberties protected within a democratic social contract. So in the American system, this idea of the Bill of Rights, just listing those rights isn't enough, right? We need to have structures in place to allow those protections. We need to have a government that has to at least give some thought to minority rights, and certainly a court system that's designed to protect minority rights, but also top down, right? The whole concept of nation state, local government, and federalism is that we can defer to more local communities, because it may be that we do have a small local community that in the greater context of the whole country is a minority, but if they can govern themselves for the most part, then we are allowing for those minority protections relative to state government, national government, however it goes. So this idea of incorporation is the terminology that we use, is the process by which these protections are bestowed, protections for individuals from state government, from local government. The idea of incorporation is the judicial branch, the courts offering these protections, in particular for minority rights. And this idea of incorporation is how we've expanded and extended the Bill of Rights to do more. And this kind of ties back. The 14th Amendment in 1868 is the start here, that the idea that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, and property. So what is this? This is the very first time that we're going to actually have a command coming from on high, the national government, the U.S. Constitution, that says that minority rights in particular, but the rights of all citizens, are going to be protected not just by the national government, by state governments, by local governments as well, because once you're a citizen of the United States, you get all of the privileges, and that's whether you're popular or not, rich or poor, black or white, whatever it may be. Right? Everybody's a citizen, everybody gets protection, and that is most necessary for those smaller interests, niche interests, minority interests. So when we talk about extending the Bill of Rights, this usually blows some people's minds, is how long it actually takes. So it's a good 150 years that it's going to take us from the implementation of the Constitution until, for the very first time, we are actually going to say that a right guaranteed as an American citizen actually belongs to you regardless of what state you live in. It's 1925, the very first time that states are told that they have to respect individual rights. And the 1925 case is in particular, it's Gitlow versus New York. Benjamin Benjamin Gitlow was a socialist. He's a commie in New York in the 1920s. It wasn't quite this, well, it wasn't terribly different than it is now. There was certainly a group in society that was very anti-communism, anti-socialism, but it was, a niche interest. And what was Gitlow doing? He was standing on the curb in New York distributing socialist pamphlets. And he was arrested, and he was taken to jail, and he was prosecuted, and he was sent to prison. And he protested, and he challenged this violation. He said, I have freedom of speech as an American citizen. I can promote socialism all I want. And it worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed. The Supreme Court said, yeah, you do. Now, the Supreme Court also told the state of New York that they could keep him in prison, because in addition to handing out those pamphlets, the Supreme Court also said that, those pamphlets and the statements he was making specifically called for people to go grab their weapons and overthrow the government. So they said that he was a clear and present danger. The freedom of speech that you have protects your right to promote socialism, but it doesn't protect your right to tell people to go grab their weapon and shoot government officials. So this is the process that we've used to extend those rights. And since then, we've extended most of the rights mentioned in the Bill of Rights, mentioned throughout the Constitution. There's not that many of them, truth be told, but for the most part, those have been extended. So what's the lesson of Gitlow? What's the lesson of Madison? Is that the structure of the government itself has to be the source of the protection. And that's going to be the different competing institutions. So if you take the Gitlow case, there's kind of these 5 different institutional decisions that get made. So in New York, the law itself that said you're not allowed to promote socialism, that had to be passed via a state legislature. It had to be signed and enforced by the governor. It had to be enforced as well by local police. So that's going to be the executive at the city level. Arrested Gitlow. He had to go to court. The law itself was upheld by the courts in the state of New York. But the federal court system, here we're at now institution number 5, the federal court system had to use its constitutional understanding to clarify the New York law and say that Gitlow, what he had done was actually, somewhat legal. Ultimately, the executive branch in the state of New York is going to pardon Gitlow, even for the clear and present danger of violation. So a future governor, relative to the governor that actually passed the law in the first place, we're at, what now, 5, 6, depending on how you want to count that New York governor role, who all have a hand in producing this decision. This is by Madison's design, right? Madison wanted a republic where states and nation competed, where local and state governments, where states and states competed with each other. He wanted a system where a legislature is elected every 2 years for the House, every 6 years for the Senate, but on a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 rotation. Or the president elected in a totally separate sort of system on a 4-year term. He wants lots of different people from lots of different places, lots of different time periods, lots of different circumstances and situations, all working together and competing to try to produce the best possible outcome. And this is inspired in some form by John Stuart Mill, who writes a lot about liberties and the protection of liberties. And he has this idea of the marketplace of ideas that basically argues that in order to have progress in a community, you need to have this battle of ideas. Every idea is valid, at least at first glance, and we need to let them fight it out, and we need people to argue it out, and we need to arrive at what the wisdom of the crowd believes to be, the best of the available solutions and outcomes. And we don't always get it right. It's a trial and error process. We're going to do it right sometimes. We're not going to do it right other times. Sometimes we have to go back and correct the things we've done. And that is the crux of 250 years of American government. So what is it that we actually have in our institutions? Is the idea of the government is we are trying, not always well, but trying to translate the will of the people into law, right? So the Constitution, this idea of the compound republic, federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, all the things we've talked about so far this semester, the whole idea is that they fight, that they don't agree, that they have conflict, because all of them in the process of that conflict, every state, every legislator, different executives, different government agencies, different groups of people in our pluralist system are all pushing boundaries. They are all coming up with new ideas and different ideas and allowing that marketplace of ideas to do its work. And as long as those institutions are fighting against each other, as long as we have this tension for Madison, that's perfect, right? Because a government that's fighting amongst itself is going to allow for negative liberty. If it's fighting amongst itself, it can't be paying attention to everything I do. It's going to give me freedom in the negative sense. But at the same time, what it can agree on, he assumes and he hopes, and he's more right than he is wrong if we kind of bounce it around American history and take the idea of the process, that it's going to produce laws and protections and decisions that hopefully, ultimately, are going to address that positive aspect of liberty, that it's going to be there to ensure that to the greatest extent possible, my rights, regardless of my status, get protected and get respected. So what do we see as citizens? Our role is to fight. Our role is to push. Our role is to act on our own interests. And what I always challenge students to do is remember that those contradictions and those fights and those disagreements are central to the process of good, democratic, pluralistic government. There's no one side that's always right. There's no one side that's always wrong. There are better ideas and worse ideas, but the whole situation is that we need to allow the process to do its job. And this is American history, right? American history is full of these conflicts, and it goes back to the very founding of America. There are not one founding, but two foundings of America. The first would be New England, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, seeking out religious freedom and trying to build that city on the hill. But that's the same country. It's just a couple hundred miles from the other founding of America down in Virginia, which was, a money-making, oftentimes genocidal endeavor to conquer and conquest and reap the benefits of this new territory. And whether it's, a nation founded in the pursuit of the Almighty God or the Almighty Dollar, that's a fight we still fight. We still have that disagreement, and that underlying, conflict still dictates a lot of our politics. If you don't like the broad stroke of American foundings, think of how we treat George Washington, right? George Washington is usually depicted as this very honorable, respected, dignified, the cherry tree, cannot tell a lie, and yet, Washington, in the big scheme of things and global in context, is he's a revolutionary. He's a radical. He is certainly, an important and dignified figure in the American context, but even the way that we think of him, imagine this ragtag bunch of rebels hiding behind trees, shooting at the guys in the red coats. It wasn't dignified. It was inappropriate warfare. No good civilized people would ever do such a thing. And yet, this is General Washington, right? We have a Declaration of Independence that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with these inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, this is the same document written by a guy who owned multiple slaves. And it has been, a long and ongoing struggle to ensure life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, not just for men, but for women, not just for white men, but for people of color as well. And this is where we get into things like the civil rights movement. And obviously, even in 2020, we're still fighting this same fight. If we flip over the enduring conflict between Democrats and Republicans, we've just had the latest round of that just in the last couple of weeks with the 2020 election. And you know what? It's not that every conflict is going to be good. It's not that every movement is going to be positive. But the underlying idea that we're hoping for really is that when we take, this perspective and that perspective, that we can work them together, that we can integrate, that we can build something new and better on the flip side or as a result. So what you've got this week, hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit more with Berlin, the idea of positive and negative rights, positive and negative freedoms, a little bit more kind of context to work with there. And as you're looking forward to the civil rights pieces, what I hope you're going to find as you kind of hit some of those different civil rights perspectives is that you're going to see some of those different tensions from different time periods, from different philosophical perspectives. And what you might note is that none of them historically, none of them in the present, none of them is 100% a reflection of our modern system. None of them are perfect. All of them have their problems. There is no one always perfect right solution. So the best we can do is, respect those tensions, respect the conflict, and know that by design, that's the way it's supposed to be. And with that, I will sign off for y'all for tonight, and I will hopefully see you all soon.